G'day, mate. Welcome to episode 76 of the Exponential Performance Podcast. In this episode, we are talking about different training peaks, charts, and metrics that can help improve your performance and the training process in terms of the art and the science of training. We also dig into a listener question around Zone 2 training on hilly terrain, and also if you have started Zwift training during the quarantine lockdown period, should you use heart rate or power, or is it both? Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Exponential Performance Podcast. Join sports scientist and performance coach Matty Graham to find out how to train smarter and maximize your performance no matter who you are.
G'day, mate. Welcome to episode 76 of the Exponential Performance Podcast. It's so good to have you here. Nick Taylor, how are you getting on this week, mate?
I am good, thank you. I am having a bit of a recovery week personally this week, so I'm actually feeling quite good. Not smashed in the hurt box every day, which I have been doing.
Nice.
So,
do you find that during the recovery week sometimes you feel tired?
this is probably not a great week to answer that question because we got a kitten on the weekend, and the kitten's found that it likes to zoom around the house at night time. But in general, you can do it, because you're not active the same. So I do notice you might have 2 or 3 days of recovery or a lower load week, and you do just feel a bit more lethargic, as opposed, maybe not tired, because I find I sleep better, but I am more lethargic, so I don't have that same kind of get up and go in the morning because you're not getting up to do a session sometimes or so forth. Yeah,
a lot of people, a lot of comments I get from athletes and something I've experienced myself is that you feel tired during recovery weeks or, lethargic, and people are like, well, shouldn't I be feeling really fresh now? But I think the thing you got to remember is that during that recovery week is your body's playing that catch-up game then. So it's recovering from all that stuff that you've been doing over the last few weeks. And because you're not active like you usually are, like you said, Nick, your stress hormones aren't the same, and those stress hormones, that adrenaline, the cortisol, they're the things that sort of pick you up and make you feel alive or active or good. And so when you don't have those coursing through your bloodstream on a daily basis, then you do feel a little flat as well. So it's very normal to feel tired during a recovery week. So don't freak out if that's the case. The key thing is that we want to feel really fresh going into our next loading phase. A little bit off topic, but I thought I'd ask, Nick, since you brought that up.
Yeah.
So today we are going to talk for our last episode of the Training Peaks series. And today I just wanted to talk about a couple of different charts or analytics that you can use in Training Peaks that some don't always get utilized as best as they possibly could. So today I wanted to talk about 3 different aspects, and the first one is peak power or peak heart rate or peak pace graphs. So this can be found over on your dashboard, and what it is it takes all of the information from the last however long you set it up for, but you can set it up for, say, like the last 3 months, and it'll give you your peak power for I think it does 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minute, 5 minute, 12 minutes, 20 minutes, 60 minutes. And I think it even goes out longer than that. I don't have it right in front of me. But essentially what it does is it creates this curve of your peak heart rate or peak power or peak pace, whatever you set it up as. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to do a couple of things. For those people who haven't done a functional threshold power test, or don't want to do one because it's not a convenient time, or whatever it might be, or just want a quick, easy way to find your functional threshold heart rate or power or speed, so that you can then take that and set some speed zones or some training intensity zones a little bit more accurately. You can go in there and either take the 30-minute peak and then do your little adjustment 5% adjustment for your functional threshold, power, heart rate or speed, or you can go to the 60-minute one and take that. And that is actually your functional threshold, heart rate, power or speed right there. And you can take that number and chuck it into your training zone calculation. So you don't actually have to go out and do a functional threshold test, which can be really good if you just want to set things up quickly. And as long as you have been doing a wide range of different types of training, so if you've only been doing base training, everything's going to be quite low if you've just set it for the last couple of months, because that's only going to take into account those sessions, and all of those are going to be relatively low. But if there's a couple of races in there in the last few months, a couple of races, some interval sessions, some endurance sessions as well, then it's going to be a pretty good representation of all of those critical powers, heart rates or paces. So it can be useful in that respect. The other thing it can be really useful is give you a little bit of a picture of the type of athlete you are. So for example, for a cyclist, if you have got really high critical powers through those 5, 10 second brackets, but then around that 1 to 2 minute mark, they really start to fade, well, it potentially tells us that you're a really anaerobic sprinter type athlete. Or the opposite could be true. You've got really good functional threshold power, but your power's down at your 10 second, 1 minute, they're not very high. So it tells us that maybe you're a really good aerobic beast, so to speak, like a time trialist. And that if you're a road racer and you always find yourself getting dropped in a breakaway or a sprint finish, then that's what we need to work on to try and bring those critical powers up down at that other end. On Sufferfest, which is kind of another online training platform, Sufferfest have the 4D power analysis. And what this does is it does a test that tests your 5 second, 10 second, 1 minute and functional threshold power. And essentially what it does is it builds that profile around the rider. So that idea of testing different power brackets or different heart rate brackets or different speed brackets if you're a runner is a really good way of kind of developing a little bit of a profile around yourself. So that critical power or the peak power, peak speed, peak heart rate chart in Training Peaks, you can use that kind of just by default because it's all there because it's been collecting all of those numbers. You don't necessarily have to go out and do these specific tests if you've been doing a wide range of training intensities in your training at the time. Do you want to say anything about that, Nick? Have you used that before?
I do have a skim over it from time to time. The one little, I guess, tip, especially for triathletes, is if you are looking at like a peak pace graph or a heart rate graph, you're going to, initially when you open that graph, you're going to see it for all of your sports combined. Mm-hmm. You need to go into the settings, which is the 3 little lines on the graph itself, and change it to run or bike or whatever you want to look at, because otherwise your pace graph from your biking is going to be way out if you're looking at that and thinking it's running type of thing. But I think especially for long running, I mean, we often talk about power and biking, but for running, the pace from a long run point of view, especially on a flat surface, is a really powerful tool in terms of keeping that training intensity in a certain zone, because it's not as impacted by external factors like heart rate is. So pace for running is a bit like power for biking. So I think that's something that a lot of runners and triathletes could use a little bit more of in terms of monitoring their pace, that's for sure.
Yeah, and we talked about it in a couple of episodes ago when we talked about making sure that your running zones are set up or your running intensities are set up with pacing as well, or to change that from pacing TSS to heart rate TSS, because if it's on run TSS, it's going to be based off your pacing zones. And if you haven't got your pacing zones set up, then they're going to come out a bit wonky in terms of that TSS. So if you want to quickly set up your pacing zones, have a look at that peak pacing chart, take out that threshold pace, bang it into your training zones, and that'll calculate them around that. The next little thing I wanted to talk about was the metrics function in Training Peaks. So there is a function in Training Peaks where you can add daily metrics, like what your resting heart rate was, or how many hours of sleep you got, how you're feeling sort of on a scale, how you're feeling, what your mood's like, how tired you are, muscle fatigue, that sort of thing. Now, these metrics are super helpful for a couple of reasons. The first is for you to have a think about how you're responding to different training and how your body is reacting to it. And then to track patterns over time, because training is not just here's a program, do these specific things to these specific numbers, and we're going to get a result at the end of the day. The process of training is all about, here's what we think's going to work, let's go and start doing it, and then depending on how you're responding to it, let's make little adjustments along the way. Because even though we base our training advice on the research of what has worked really well for the majority of people, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for you in your specific case. Or it might not work for you today, but it might work for you next year in a different way, just based on where you're at, what you're doing, your other life stresses and that sort of thing. So using training metrics alongside all of this other data kind of crafts what we're doing from the science of the training and kind of including the art of training. The more information that we have to be able to adjust things, adjust the dials accordingly, so to speak, the better. Because at the end of the day, it's not just do this and this will happen. We need to adjust it to the individual. And that brings me to the next thing on Training Peaks that I wanted to talk about is the comments section. The comments section. Now, this is probably the one time when comments are really helpful and where you should read all of the comments. Unlike other platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, comments often aren't that helpful on those other platforms and you shouldn't read them. But in Training Peaks, comments are really helpful. And again, we see how your body responded or what you did in the session based on your heart rate, your power, your speed, where you went, how fast you went, how fast you didn't go maybe at certain times. But the comments of how you subjectively felt about the session, how you felt during it, what you did, the thoughts you had, those things are really helpful from a coaching perspective to then be able to inform what we're doing going forward. Because if you hated the session and you really didn't like it because it was really, really hard, excellent, we'll give you 3 of those next week. No, just kidding. But it does help know where your head's at in terms of the training. If you've done your 5th session of the week and every single one of them has been in the pouring rain, it's a really good indicator to a coach that, well, maybe we can program some indoor sessions coming up, because training for that long in the wet can start to wear on you physically and mentally as well. Or that during the 3rd set of your intervals, you started to feel a wee niggle in your foot. And that could be a precursor to a stress fracture, but we can't tell that from just looking at your speed and your power or your heart rate numbers. Had no idea that you felt a wee niggle in your foot on the 3rd set of your intervals, but we do know that from your comments. So comments can be really powerful. So between metrics and the comment section, we're able to get a lot more information about you and how you're responding to the training over and above just looking at the metrics that are coming in from heart rate monitor or the power meter. The other thing that those metrics and comments are really useful for is next year or the next build-up or 3 years down the track when you go back to the same race. What did we do? Oh, so we did this, this, and this. If there's no comments, no metrics, there's no context around the sessions. So sure, we did these sessions, but how did they actually go? were they, did you find them really good? Were they too easy? Were they too hard? Those comments, those metrics allow more information around those things so that we can look back on them and say, right, we did this, but this time let's adjust it. Let's do a little bit more, a little bit less, because last time you felt it that it was too much. And we know that because of the comment section. Nick, anything around those?
Yeah, I quite like the metric section in Training Peaks, especially for people that are monitoring HRV. And I know we've touched on that before, and it might be time to retouch on that at some point, but a lot of the HRV apps that people have will sync up to Training Peaks anyway. So you're putting in your metrics into the HRV app, and then it's syncing across to your Training Peaks and pops up there as a number, which then you can plot on a graph through one of the Training Peak graphs that they produce as a metric graph, and you can select HRV as one of those numbers, and you can track it over time to see what it's doing and how you are responding to said training from a pretty accurate measure like HRV. And the other one is weight. So people that are trying to potentially lose some body weight for an endurance sport through their winter season or their base phase, just taking your weight once a week and plugging it into Training Peaks can give you a really nice way to monitor how things are progressing, how different training loads affect your weight. Generally your big training weeks, you're going to be trying to eat more to sustain those training weeks. So they're probably not the weeks you want to target for your weight loss. But on your recovery week, you might say, okay, I'm going to reduce my calories a little bit on the recovery week, to help with that weight sort of management component. And then certainly with comments on training sessions, the ones I tend to focus on more are the red training sessions, so the sessions that have been missed. If there's a comment in there, ran out of time, kids got sick, whatever the case may be, just so I can know, okay, that's not due to injury or poor performance or something like that, then it's a really nice way just to check on how people are progressing with different sessions. Or like you said, if people aren't enjoying a certain session for a particular reason, and I'm just continuing to reprogram the same sessions and they don't tell me, then it's going to help with decreasing their enjoyment of the training itself.
Yeah, so all of you EPC athletes out there, make sure you put your comments into the comment section for each session so that we know how you're getting on. And for those people that are self-trained or training with another coach, make sure you put your comments in there as well, either for your coach or for yourself, your future self, when you look back on your training, so that you can get a little bit more of an understanding about what is actually happening over and above all of the excellent metrics and data that comes out of Training Peaks. Sometimes those comments are the most helpful things, because remember, we're not just programming robots, we're not training racehorses, we're training people who are very multifaceted and complex beings. They're not just, numbers on a spreadsheet, not just heart rates on a heart rate graph or power on a power meter. There's the art and the science of training that needs to be factored in there as well. So that's going to wrap up our Training Peaks series. It's been a good series. We had some good feedback from people saying that they've really enjoyed finding out more about Training Peaks and what the numbers and everything actually means. So if you've got any other follow-up questions for Training Peaks, let us know and we can always add them into our Q&A section. But speaking of Q&A, we are going to jump over now to a voice message that we got around Zone 2 training. Lewis, your question, please.
G'day, Matty. First of all, been listening to your podcast and think you're doing a bloody good job, mate. Question regarding Zone 2 training from me. I live in quite a hilly neighbourhood, and I find it hard to stay in Zone 2 100% of the time due to spiking as I go up a hill, essentially. When this happens, is it nullifying the effect of what we're trying to achieve within the Zone 2 session? And should I be driving to a flatter area to complete these runs if it is? Cheers.
So thanks for your question, Lewis. And remember, if you do have a question that you want answered, send us through our voice message over at exponentialperformancecoaching.com/ask ask, just like Lewis has, and we're actually going to send you a free copy of the Performance Temple handbooks as a bit of a thank you for sending in your voice question. So Nick, Zone 2 training when you live in a hilly area, what do you think?
Well, first off, it is a great question because so much of, especially New Zealand, now I don't 100% know where Lewis is from, but if he's somewhere in New Zealand, he's most likely going to be living near some sort of hills. So a quick recap of what Zone 2 is for those that may be unfamiliar. And if you're unfamiliar, I would recommend you go back and listen to some of the podcasts in the past where we have broken down the zones into what they're actually about. But Zone 2 is our endurance zone, commonly in that kind of 80 to 90% of our functional threshold heart rate. Now we'll base this around heart rate because I believe Lewis is a runner. I do apologise, Lewis, if I've got that wrong. So he's most likely using heart rate, and I suspect he's probably not using power from his bike, which he's not on. So again, Zone 2 is sort of the pace we can go at for hours and hours and hours. We're using a higher percentage of fat for fuel, and we're mostly using our type 1 muscle fibres, or those slow twitch muscle fibres. So when we're looking to train in Zone 2, we're looking to increase the growth of our mitochondria due to stimulation of those type 1 fibres. Now, increasing the mitochondria growth or the function of these mitochondria basically help us to utilise fat as an energy source at a higher intensity. So we're increasing our metabolic efficiency, which is going to benefit us in the respect that if we're using more fat for fuel, we can spare muscle glycogen. So therefore, if we get to the end of towards the end of a race, we have to put in a harder effort to get to the finish line. We're sprinting against somebody else, or we have to go up a short rise. We've got that glycogen in our muscles to utilise. It can help with weight management in terms of using the stored fat we have in our bodies, and therefore we're not having to consume the same level of a carbohydrate during a training session because our ability to utilise a fat in those lower intensities is better. And also, we're not having to take on board the same amount of food, so therefore reducing any gastric issues that might be occurring from trying to eat too much while we're running. Also increasing or improving the function of our type 1 fibres is helping us with clearing lactate from the system. Now this does this through a transporter called MCT1. Now MCT1 is essentially like a mop for lactic acid, so it's floating around the system, clearing up our lactic acid and taking it back to the mitochondrial to help it be reused for energy. Now you might say, hang on, lactic acid is produced when we are exercising at a higher intensity, so therefore it's mostly our type 2 fibres that are producing lactic acid, but our type 1 fibres are responsible for that recycling process and helping us actually reuse it. So if we're surging and increasing a bit of lactate by pushing harder and then we're backing off a little bit, our body's actually able to reuse it, so it's not going to build up in the system and sort of stop us from exercising, so to speak. So to get to Lewis's question around when training in a Zone 2 session and you're on a hill and your heart rate's rising, should he be running on the flat to basically help keep his heart rate at Zone 2? Now, the answer generally speaking would depend on how long these hills are. And so if you've got a 1 hour Zone 2 run on your training plan, you want the average of your heart rate for that 1 hour to be in your Zone 2 range. So you might start running up a hill and it might only be 3 or 4 minutes and your heart rate just rises slightly into Zone 3 and then it's going to tail off again. It may even drop into Zone 1 as you start to run down the hill on the other side. But if the average again stays within that Zone 2 across the course of your hour, then that's no drama. It's a heart rate will rise and fall and it's impacted by a few things, but the average is where we're looking to keep it for a session. However, if that hill was, let's say sort of 5 minutes or so plus, and the first few minutes you're in Zone 3, and then as you go further up the hill, you get into Zone 4 and you're getting towards your threshold, that would be the time when I'd be sort of saying, hey, you may want to back off the pace a little bit, maybe even bring it down to a walk if you have to bring the heart rate back down, because the aim of that session isn't to produce a whole bunch of lactic acid or lactate. The aim of that session is to be in your endurance zone. You're happily clearing, you're very aerobic, but when you're pushing closer to threshold, you're going to start to build up your lactic acid, and that's going to increase the recovery time for your session. So again, if your aim of the session is a zone 2, then if your goal of your session is zone 2, then your aim for that session is enhancing these endurance capabilities through fat metabolism, mitochondrial density, and basically that mental ability to maintain a steady state aerobic pace. So you want to keep your heart rate in check based on that. So if it's rising too far, that's when I would say on a hill, slow it down. I do even recommend some of my athletes for longer runs to walk up the hills. Basically, your heart rate's still going to be in an aerobic zone, but you are still moving up the hill and you can go where you need to go. But if your race or your event that you're training for has a lot of flat sections or it's quite a flat run, then absolutely you'd be wanting to drive to a flat area nearby to do some of those longer training sessions. And that's basically more around the ability to run at a pace on the flat for a continuous period of time, as opposed to using hills to kind of break, your pace is slowing down, you might be walking, changing the muscle groups and so forth. So it does come down a little bit to what event you're training for, but 100% you don't have to train on the flat to keep your heart rate in zone 2. If you've got an aerobic zone 2 run to do, you can manipulate your pace to help keep your heart rate in that average for the period of time.
Good. And I guess as well, like he asked around, like, does it nullify the effects of zone 2 if you're running up a hill and you're out of zone 2? And I mean, absolutely, because you're no longer in zone 2 anymore, are you? So you're not getting the benefits because you're working harder. And even though you might be running quite slowly because you're going uphill, the force generation by your muscles is higher, so there's more anaerobic energy contribution because more forces or more work's needed quicker to generate the forward momentum. And I think a lot of people get hung up on, if I'm not running fast, then it's not worth it. But to get zone 2 adaptations up a hill, like you say, Nick, you might actually have to walk. But walking is going to develop your aerobic capacity more than running up that hill kind of fast. Because at the end of the day, if you're running up there kind of fast, there's more anaerobic energy contribution, which shuts down your aerobic energy production because it can't keep up. So it's just anaerobic energy production. So the flow of energy is not actually coming from your aerobic energy system, which is what we're trying to train. So if you don't have a flow of energy through your aerobic energy system or coming out of your aerobic energy system, then you're not actually training your aerobic energy system at all. And so does it nullify the effect of zone 2 training? Absolutely, because you're not actually training that energy system anymore. So yeah, adapting that pace is crucial. And like you said, it's kind of like the type of hills. And I even find that those long sustained hills are kind of better because you can get into a slow rhythm and build on it. It's those real undulating up and down, up and down, up and down where people don't want to slow down and they put in that wee burst to get up over the little rise. And they spend their whole time pushing up these little rises, coasting on the way down, pushing up a little rise again, coasting on the way down. And when you look at how much time they've spent in zones afterwards, there's zone 3 and 4 quite high because of the little surges. Zone 1 quite high because of the downhills. Zone 2, which is what we're trying to focus on accumulating time in, is almost nothing because all they do is simply pass through zone 2 on the way down the hill and then on the way up the hill, So I think, finding terrain, and I understand you live in a hilly area, but finding suitable hills that allow you to achieve zone 2 is pretty important as well. Because not all hills are created equal, are they?
They are not, no. And certainly, as part of a comprehensive sort of training plan, hopefully you've got some zone 4 sort of threshold intervals in there, and they're awesome to do on a hill because your heart rate gets up high quickly. And so that's the sort of time you want to be pushing the pace up a hill in your zone 4 and then keep your zone 2 work in that lower zone 2. And don't be afraid of zone 1 either. Zone 1's got just as good benefit. Don't think it's, my heart rate's down quite low, I'm not getting anything from this. If you're walking up a hill at a decent pace and your heart rate's sort of on that cusp of zone 1, zone 2, that's just as good as, if not better than, being sort of pushing zone 3, mid zone 4 sort of stuff.
Yeah, big time. So hopefully, Lewis, that helped answer your question. If it didn't, if we just rambled on, let us know, because often I am guilty of rambling around things, especially when it comes to energy systems and zone training, because I do go off on a few tangents. So send us through any follow-up questions if you need to. And remember, if you do have a question, send us a voice question over at exponentialperformancecoaching.com/ask, and we will do our best to answer them. Remember, we will send you a free copy of the Performance Temple Handbook as a way to say thank you.
So, Matty, a question for you around Zone 2 training and the athletes that you coach or have coached in the past. Do you find that Zone 2 training is the one that people get wrong the most?
Yeah, I mean, Zone 2 training's hard. It's hard because it's not hard. Do you know what I mean? And it's the one that Zone 2, people struggle with Zone 2 and Zone 1, like if you're in active recovery, right? So most people, if you told them to go do a Zone 1 active recovery session and they didn't have a form of monitoring intensity, so no heart rate monitor, no pace, no power, and you just told them to go out and do an easy active recovery Zone 1, what they would probably go and do is a Zone 2 session, just probably from feel. If you told them to go do a Zone 2 session, they usually end up in Zone 3 because it feels somewhat hard. It feels kind of strong, but you can sustain it for a long time. Zone 2 is hard to get right because it's slower than it should feel, and you kind of feel that I should be going faster, or that this speed is not doing anything for me. And it is hard to get right. And you do have to slow down. You do have to swallow your ego a little bit, because if you are going at the speed that you feel that is good and you're huffing and puffing and sweating, which is usually Zone 3, then it's not actually doing the things that we want to on Zone 2. So really focus on paying attention to that intensity. Set yourself up for success. Pick terrain that helps you achieve Zone 2. Just like we're talking, it's hard to achieve Zone 2 on hills. It's hard to, because you've got to pay so much attention to your pace. You have to consciously walk. No one likes to be seen out walking, especially people that have got, their ego tied up in being an athlete or, training for things. And so set yourself up for success when it comes to those sessions. Choose flat roads. I know we've just been talking about you don't have to. You don't have to, but it makes it a lot easier to achieve the goal that you're after. Choose flat roads. Go out by yourself potentially. Go out and don't go out and go into a roaring headwind, because you're going to go absolutely nowhere, because your heart rate or your power is going to have to come up for you to get any sense of speed. So Zone 2 is very hard to achieve well, and people do struggle with it because it's quite far outside what they're normally used to. And I've just done a series on YouTube on Whiteboard Wednesday talking about different energy systems. And the one I've just covered is the aerobic energy system. And over the next 2 videos, I'm going to be talking about the integration of these and how these look as a whole, and what happens when we train at different intensities. And we talked a lot about this in episode 55 and 56 when we talked about zone 2 and Zone 3 training. But if you are pushing outside of these zones, then your aerobic energy system, it stops working essentially, because your anaerobic energy system takes over. And because you're no longer stressing those energy systems, the aerobic energy system, then we're not getting the adaptations that we're after. So it is really important to slow it down and to work in those targeted energy systems, if that's what you're looking for. If you're just looking forward to go out there and get a good sweat on, huff and puff, and feel like you did something, go out and just run to how you feel. But at the end of the day, we need to be a little bit more strategic, because when it comes to training, remember, training is the systematic use of regular exercise to move towards a performance goal. So if you're not systematic about what you're doing, you're not training, you're just exercising. So I'm not too sure if that even answers your question, Nick. I can't even remember what it was. Like I say, get off on a wee tangent.
No, it does, and it's brought up by the fact that every now and then I get questions around this whole idea of sweet spot training. And sweet spot training, I guess, is generally considered zone 3, kind of upper zone 3.
Yep.
And the problem, I mean, like you said, you get a good workout, you feel like you pushed hard, or you've been running fast, you're biking fast, but it's quite a big stress on the system. But it doesn't feel as big a stress as a threshold session. But the problem I find is it's such a fine line between sweet spot and threshold in terms of the intensity. You know, zone 3, if we look at heart rates, really 90 to 93% of our threshold heart rate. And our threshold heart rate measure is semi-accurate as a field test, but it's not 100% accurate. And then we're expecting to work within this very fine window. And I think it's a great metric, or a great tool, for people that have a short period of time to train for an event. They're coming in with, 8 weeks to go, need to get some decent base in. Sweet spot training can help pretty quick. But it's a good way to kind of run yourself down over time by doing repetitive sessions week in, week out as your base training in that zone 3 sweet spot area.
I mean, you nailed it with that there, and that we don't want to be doing sweet spot training in our base phase. You know what I mean? And like, there's not, and I mean, we talk about these different training zones, as in like zone 2. We kind of talked about this in this episode, like zone 2 is the only thing we want to be doing. Like, don't go into zone 3, it's bad. Don't go into zone 1, it's, it's not going to be helping you, or whatever it might be. But remember, like, we want to train in all of our training zones at different times. And the aim of a long zone 2 session is, improved fat oxidation, or increase, metabolic efficiency, mitochondrial density increase, capillarization. All of those things happen really effectively when you train in zone 2 at that slower pace. They happen in zone 3 as well, but you get more tired for the work that you put in. So you're putting in more effort for the same results, essentially, as zone 2 and zone 3. But the thing with zone 2 and base training is you want to be able to do multiple sessions throughout the week to get the accumulative training load. If you do those multiple sessions at zone 3, you can't do as many of them because it's a larger load on the body and you get fatigued. So you've got a larger load with no more results that you'd get from a less load, and you can't do as many of them, so the accumulative training volume is less. Now, sweet spot training is really important at certain times, especially end of your base phase before you transition into your speed phase of training, or often it's called the build phase of your training leading into an event. And it's a really effective tool to use to be able to work on, maintaining race pace. So it definitely has its place, but in terms of the whole concept of what we're trying to achieve at different times, we need to use different training zones at training times. And again, I'd highly recommend people revisit episode 54, 55, 56, 57, and 58, and 59, where we talked training zones and broke each training zone down, because it is quite a big in-depth topic when you get in and start talking about it. And that's why I've gone back to Whiteboard Wednesday and revisited the energy systems on there, each energy system in depth, and then the integration of these and what happens at different training intensities, and how the different energy systems respond to that. Because at the end of the day, for endurance athletes, for all athletes essentially, that's what we're training is those energy systems as a major part of what we're training. Obviously, there's the neuromuscular and the technical and the tactical and the psychological aspects of what we're doing as well. But energy systems, without our energy systems, we don't go anywhere. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating area that's never easy to get your head around. But certainly some of those podcasts you mentioned, plus the Whiteboard Wednesday, I think do tie it together quite nicely for people that are trying to get a grapple on it.
I mean, like you said, it's complex. I mean, it's the essence of life is what we're trying to describe here. Like metabolism and the production of energy. Like they're not simple concepts, you know. And what we're trying to do is ideally, hopefully people are starting to get a grasp on what they are and how they help and what we're trying to do to manipulate them to get what we're after as an athlete. But yeah, at the end of the day, they are quite complex. But I always endeavour to try and explain them the best way that I can and the best way that I understand them. And hopefully the next 2 videos that I've got coming out on Whiteboard Wednesday over on my YouTube channel, they go a long way to explaining them. Hopefully, let me know what you think. Now, I've got one last question here. One last question. Hopefully we've got time to talk about it. But it came from an athlete who has just got into Zwift racing or riding over the lockdown period. And they said, I looked at all of your videos and podcasts and I see you do a lot about heart rate. And now I've just started Zwift training, which is obviously power-based. What should I use, power or heart rate? And based on the amount of heart rate information that we talk about and the videos and the podcasts and the articles that I've got out there, do I actually think power is any good, or do I just bang on about heart rate because I think that's better? So, heart rate versus power. What should you use if you've got both available and you're just getting into Zwift? And I guess I'd preface that with the reason that I have so much stuff out there about heart rate is because it's so available to people. The majority of people at the moment or over the last 4 or 5 years, majority of endurance athletes have relied on a heart rate as their training intensity guide. Now, power is just another measure of training intensity. Power is a more accurate measure of training intensity when it comes to cycling because it's actually a measure of the work that is done, the physical work that is done, how hard you're pushing on the pedals and how fast you're spinning those pedals around, force times velocity. That gives us our power. Heart rate, on the other hand, is your body's response to the work that's been done, if that makes sense. So it's not as accurate for measuring work done as power is. So Zwift, should you use power or heart rate? Well, the first thing I'd say is both of them are very valuable sources of information, and they give us information about different things as well. They give us information about different things. So power gives us that instantaneous work done. This is how much work you are doing. This is how hard you are working at this very moment in time. Heart rate, like I say, is the response to the work happening. And there's a little bit of a lag to it, as we talked about episode 58, where we talked about VO2 max training as well, and how heart rate isn't really useful for that because of the lag that happens in heart rate. So what should we use? Heart rate, power. Obviously, we're going to use power because it's quite accurate or very accurate. But also think about what your heart rate is doing at the same time. During base training and during long sustained endurance efforts on the bike, heart rate's actually a really good metric to focus on because power fluctuates a lot just because of the nature of it. Heart rate's more steady. So heart rate can be really good to look at when you're doing long sustained endurance rides. When you're doing speed focused stuff or power focused stuff, when you're riding harder or faster, that's where power becomes really helpful because it changes instantaneously and it's very accurate. Whereas heart rate lags and it's just a response to work. You might finish your effort and your heart rate's just coming up. So there's a couple of different ideas around it. let's say we're riding along on this particular day and our power is 200 watts and it's feeling really, really hard to sustain that. And you look down at your heart rate monitor and your heart rate is sky high. What's that telling us? Well, potentially telling us that you're starting to get a bit fatigued, or there could be outside stress from life. There's more adrenaline in your system and it's making your heart rate skyrocket. So this could be a really good indicator that you need a bit of a rest. If we were just looking at power and we say 200 watts, I can usually do this really easily. Why is it feeling so hard? We don't really know. But if we have heart rate, it gives us a bit of an idea. The other thing is we could be holding 200 watts and it feels really hard, but our heart rate is really low and we can't get our heart rate up. And what that tells us is that we potentially have been pushing too hard for too long. And now that we're getting into a little bit more of a chronic state of overtraining potentially, where our heart rate is no longer responding to the adrenaline that's being released into our system. Because when we work really hard, the body releases adrenaline to increase our heart rate, to mobilize fuel supplies, to be able to do the work. And if our heart rate's not responding to it anymore, it's become desensitized to it because it's been exposed to it so often. And so again, that tells us something about what's happening within our body. So while power is the gold standard for measuring work on the bike, heart rate is a very useful tool as well. So the main thing I'd say is use power, but also look at heart rate, just to get that concept of what's going on. For both of those metrics, though, make sure you go and set your training zones up correctly around them. Because again, if you're just looking at power, but you haven't gone out and tested it with a functional threshold power test, or gone and look at your critical power and picked out those numbers, then there's no point using power. You know, people say, if I get a power meter, will it make me better? Well, no, it won't. It won't make you any better at all unless you use it strategically. So first thing you should always do is do a functional threshold power test or a functional threshold heart rate test for that matter. Set your training zones up and then start using those monitors to train at different intensities to achieve different things. Most people, however, are just going to jump on Zwift, sign up for the first race that they see and just smash it completely. And if that's the way that you're going to use Zwift, go for it. Bunch of fun. But if you want to use it a little bit more strategically, think about those power zones that you are riding in and what you're trying to get out of each of them. Nick, as someone who is an avid Zwift rider, what are your thoughts around heart rate and power?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of key things to remember too, especially just on those zones that you're talking about, the FTP or the FTHR, the functional threshold heart rate, is your heart rate zones aren't going to change that dramatically over time. You might find your threshold heart rate creeps up a beat or two, and so your zones just shift a fraction, versus your functional threshold power. Ideally, that number is going to increase with time if you're training efficiently. So your power zones are going to shift. So it might be that you're in zone 3 heart rate, but zone 4 power 1 week. And then 6 months down the track, that's not quite the same anymore. So don't get too caught up on, I'm in zone 3 on one and zone 4 on the other, what's going on. They're not going to be identical, and they will change over time. Also with training inside, often I find that the start of a ride inside feels easier from a heart rate point of view. And then it's that decoupling process happens to some extent because of the heat that is generated inside, unless you've got a really efficient way of cooling. I unfortunately haven't had any fans over lockdown in my Zwifting room. I just have an open window nearby, and if there's not enough airflow going on, I get really hot really quickly. And so that raises the heart rate, or that perceived exertion effect, even though your power's not going to be changing. So that is one effect to take into consideration. And also the type of trainer that you have. So I've been fortunate to play around with a Tax Vortex, which is a wheel-on Bluetooth smart heart rate Bluetooth power trainer, and then a Tax Flux, which is a wheel off. You put your cassette chain around a cassette on the trainer itself. Now with the Flux and with my wheel off, I find the feel of that trainer to be a lot more specific to what I would be on my bike outside. So therefore my heart rate is higher for the same power that I'm putting out. Put the wheel back on and go back to my Vortex, and it feels a lot easier, so I can push a easier power or harder power, and my heart rate doesn't go up the same. So there's a couple of differences there that you need to be mindful of with your specific trainer. And I would almost say with the wheel on trainers, really focus on that heart rate. If you can get your heart rate up by increasing the watts, then you're artificially sort of increasing your wattage on Zwift as a gain, but you're getting the workout that you want from a heart rate point of view, which is going to be more specific when you go back out on the road. Take away the indoor training component of it. I think it's a little bit more specific when you're out on the road with power versus your heart rate, because you don't have that same internal sort of environment causing issues. And don't forget too, on a trainer, your bike's not moving unless you've got one of those fancy rock plates. There's no upper body work, essentially. You could sit up and push the same amount of power out of your legs. So you don't have the same whole body effect on your heart rate as well to bring that heart rate up quicker. So keep that in mind too for your warm-up. You're trying to keep your core stimulated, hold on to the handlebars, and sort of tense the upper body every now and then just to help keep the actual stimulus of biking outside.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Like a lot of people who use power outside will jump on their bike indoors and think, far out, I can't get my power up to what it usually is. Like it's so much harder. Like what's going on? And the thing is exactly the same. 100 watts is 100 watts inside or outside, given that the calibration of whatever you're measuring with is the same, obviously. But it's just that perception. When you're inside, like you said, there's no airflow. And so there's no perception of moving forward. When you're outside, that air flows over you, one, to cool you down, but it also, things move past you and there's a perception of speed, and you can think, okay, I'll push a little bit harder. Oh, I'm instantly going faster. Inside, the whole space-time continuum shifts, and you're just in this vortex of suffering and going absolutely nowhere, and it just hurts and hurts and hurts and hurts a lot more. So be prepared for that as well, in that it does feel harder. But if you haven't used power outside, then that's probably not going to be a thing. But that's another thing. People sit on their trainer to warm up. They get to the end of their warm-up and their heart rate hasn't even got over 120 beats a minute. Do you know what I mean? Because it feels like they're doing something, but they're just there twiddling their legs over. As soon as they, click it up a couple of gears, add a little bit of resistance and put some load on them, like, oh, that's actually quite hard. And it's like, well, that's probably what you just go outside and warm up at normally. But it feels a lot different when you're indoors. Yeah.
And I mean, to touch on, I guess, the Zwift racing component of it too, you can change the resistance on your Zwift setup on the computer or the TV or whatever you're using. So you've got the resistance on your trainer that's been applied through Zwift, and you can change the resistance on the Zwift to make it 0 to 100% of the actual hill or gradient on Zwift. So if you're going along on a 4% gradient, and you've set your resistance to 50, it's going to feel like a 2% gradient. And therefore, when you're going down a hill, let's say a minus 4% gradient going down a hill, it's only going to feel like a minus 2, not minus 4. And so people will manipulate that percentage to enable them to pedal faster going down a hill, so the power stays up, so the speed stays up more, and they get a better feel for the race, but it's going to project them further than if you have your resistance set to 100. And so all of a sudden the minus 4 is minus 4 and you're spinning away frantically and you're competing with someone that's spinning at 0%. So there's a lot of intricacies with the racing side of things that are very unspecific to actually racing on the road. A lot of fun and a lot of, it's been great for lockdown for people to get together and ride together and have some fun and a bit of a laugh, but don't take it too seriously in terms of thinking, oh man, I'm going to be completely sort of out the back of the pack in the next race when we get outside. Because you might find that you're not compared to some people that you think are flying past you now just because they've got a different type of trainer or they've set things up differently or something like that.
Excellent. And again, a little bit of a tangent there, but heart rate or power, bottom line is whether you're indoors or outdoors, Zwifting or actual riding, use both. Both of them are important. They tell us different things. Monitoring both of them is helpful at the end of the day. So thanks for that question. And I think Ray sent that in via email. So thanks, Ray. I hope all of your Zwift training has been going well. Hopefully you don't require it too much longer and you can get back out. And well, we can get back out at the moment and enjoy the outdoors, but there still seems to be this tendency to stay indoors because there is still a lot of stuff happening out there. And we can't get back to our normal yet. The new normal. That's what people are talking about, the new normal. I don't know about that, the new normal. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. All right, mate. Thanks for joining us. I hope you found it useful this week. If you've got any questions, let us know so that we can do our best to give you the good information so you can keep training harder, but most importantly, train smarter. We'll talk to you next episode. Mate, thanks for listening. If you would like to support this podcast and see it continue into the future, you can do so in a number of ways. Firstly, make sure you subscribe to this channel on whatever platform you are listening. Like and share the podcast on social media to help spread the word. If you're feeling really generous, head over and leave a review and a rating over on iTunes. This helps spread the word and develop the podcast. All of this will help the podcast continue long into the future so we can keep bringing you the information you need to train hard, but most importantly, train smart.